Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm continuing on with part 3 of A Bit of Orange's response to the Evolution 101 website. I would recommend starting with part 1, but this should make sense even if you watch it out of order. Today he has some issues with taxonomy and decides that the word hypothesis is best defined as a guess. He doesn't even mention the fact that he skipped over the bit where you can click on the word hypothesis and it gives you a proper definition, which I guess means that he was lying when he said,
"The site I am reviewing is called Evolution 101, and will be presented by me with no editing, though plenty of editorials. And in those few places where parts were cut out for brevity, I make note of it being done."
So on to the video!
Just remember, the stuff presented by this creepy bear is from the Evolution 101 website, written by the Understanding Evolution team. Commentary by Rentafriend2000, that's me!
The family tree. The process of evolution produces a pattern of relationships between species.
I think what they meant is, patterns of perceived relationships between species, when limitlessly extrapolated into the past, create our belief in the unobservable process of evolution.
Okay, so where would you put the limit exactly? Do you deny that all species we know fit nicely into a nested hierarchy of shared characteristics? Do you also deny that through gene sequencing we have found that this hierarchy matches up pretty well with shared genetic material? Do you see any limit that stops organisms from sharing characteristics? Let's go through some basic phylogeny here. Do you agree that human beings are eukaryotic and multicellular, digest food in an internal chamber, aka the stomach, lack rigid cell walls, and are motile, or they can move around? If you agree with this, then by definition, you have agreed that humans are animals, because that's literally the definition of an animal. Do you agree that we have a spinal column? Well then again, by definition, we are in a subsection of the chordate phylum known as the vertebrates. Would you agree that we are warm-blooded, have hair, and nurse our young with milk secreted from mammary glands? Well, once again, by definition, we are therefore mammals. Would you also agree that we don't produce our own vitamin C, have dry noses, and have an upper lip that is not directly connected to our nose or gums? We have a single-chambered uterus and typically have single births? Well then, you should agree that we belong in the suborder Haplorini. Again, this is definitional, so even if you disagree with evolution, if you agree that we do in fact have all these traits, then by definition, you agree that we are animals of the suborder Haplorini. Then finally we get to the genus Homo. Do you have relatively large cranial capacity, a limb structure that is best for having an erect posture and a bipedal gait, fully opposable thumbs and hands capable of both power and precision grips? Then I've got good news for you. You're a Homo. So all this to say, life fits neatly into these little categories. Every step back you take from humans in the Homo sapiens sapiens category includes more and more organisms until you finally get back to the kingdom of Animalia, wherein lies all of the animal life on the planet. If you disagree that humans are animals, then at that point you're simply just arguing with the dictionary, because definitionally speaking, we are. And guess what else? We have a fairly complete knowledge of how we got to humans from the first single-celled organisms. For more detail on that, I would highly recommend Aaron Ra's Systematic Classification of Life series, linked down below. He's on video 19 of the series, and he hasn't even gotten to the beginning of the dinosaurs yet. He's tracing the evolution of human beings through all the transitional forms we have found throughout history, and it's a surprisingly complete record. Essentially, it boils down to the same points I have made here, except he goes through specifically which animals were the first that we know of to develop certain traits, and he goes through many more of the traits than I have, and in much greater detail. It's a fantastic series. Again, I highly recommend it.
But any otherwise horrible thing can be lovable if it has more hair.
All this to say, even if the process were unobservable, which it isn't, the nested hierarchy that occurs naturally is excellent evidence for evolution. Why else would everything fit so neatly into it?
But if they spent a lot of time being that accurate, they wouldn't have much of a story anymore.
Let's turn this around, shall we? Biblically literalist Christians believe in an unobservable, untestable God who has been observed and tested in the past, but these observations and tests are completely non-repeatable. This god is also morally perfect, but has no problem with committing genocide, allowing children to die in many painful ways, literally watching people get raped without doing anything to prevent it, and throwing good people into an eternal lake of fire for not believing in him without evidence, while allowing bad people into eternal paradise on the merits of a deathbed conversion. But if Christians were that accurate, they wouldn't get very many converts now, would they?
Maybe I'm being too picky.
No, you're not being picky. You're being disingenuous at best and dishonest at worst.
As they explain this below, you will see that they are going to agree with what I've just said.
I can't wait.
As lineages evolve and split and modifications are inherited, their evolutionary paths diverge. This produces a branching pattern of evolutionary relationships. By studying inherited species characteristics and other historical evidence, we can reconstruct evolutionary relationships and represent them on a family tree, called a phylogeny.
Let me read between the lines a little. Reconstruct means invent.
So the Evolution 101 page agrees with you, as long as you read between the lines, aka completely misrepresent what they are actually saying, in order to make it seem to line up with your strawman theory of evolution. Now let me clarify here. Reconstruct means put together as best as we can with all the available evidence. It does not mean invent.
This is another way of saying, we don't observe this happening, thus making it not observational science, but we can use our imaginations and lead ourselves to believe that it did happen, and maybe, just maybe, it's sort of happening still.
How is it not happening still? Did you miss the part where it took millions of years? What we observe happening today is exactly what we would expect if evolution had and continues to happen. Are you going to start asking us to produce a crocoduck like Kirk Cameron? Because a crocoduck would pretty much disprove the theory of evolution. You find me a duck egg that hatches into a crocoduck, and I will, the moment it is demonstrated to not be a hoax, renounce my acceptance of evolution. And this is the main difference between science and creationism. Good scientists are willing to change their minds when presented with contrary evidence. In fact, scientists that hold on to favored hypothesis after the evidence starts mounting against them are often ridiculed in the scientific community. Scientists sometimes spend their entire careers trying to prove each other wrong, because the scientist who overturns a largely accepted hypothesis and finds a new hypothesis that better fits the evidence will go down in history. In other words, phylogeny alone is pretty much enough to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that evolution has and continues to happen. That is, even if we didn't have all the other evidence for evolution, such as the fossil record, gene sequencing, embryology, molecular biology, and so on.
Does anyone else suspect that when they said evolution is science, they meant it is Scientology?
What is that even supposed to mean? I mean, I couldn't find much information on it, but it seems like Scientologists accept evolution. But what exactly was the point of that quip? Is it just a really bad association since Scientology has the same first few letters as science? Your jokes are going from bad to just plain lazy. Like, honestly, science? You mean Scientology? That isn't even good enough to be a dad joke. What do you call a chicken when it looks at lettuce? Chicken sees a salad. That's a joke. See how the second part, known as the punchline, is actually related to the first part, which is known as the setup? If they're not related in some way, it's just not funny.
And please note, just as I said above, they study present characteristics,
as well as past ones found in the fossil record.
Group animals by some shared characteristics, and then extrapolate limitlessly into the past to invent these family trees.
It's not limitless, and we don't have to do quite as much extrapolation as you might think. Again, refer to R and Ra's current series to see exactly how much information we actually have on the matter, and then realize that he is only tracing one lineage. We can do the same thing for dozens of other organisms whose lineages are well represented in the fossil record, such as whales and birds. And then realize that with how rare fossilization is, the fact that we have such a complete representation of so many lines kinda leads to the conclusion that evolution is true. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to trace evolution through the fossil record.
I don't make this stuff up, you know. And when you don't believe me, it hurts my feelings.
No, I don't think you're clever enough to make this stuff up. You just parrot what you find at places like Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research. Some of your stuff even comes from Kent Hovind, who he uses arguments that even Answers in Genesis won't touch. We can see how terrible you are at making stuff up when you say things like,
Does anyone else suspect that when they said evolution is science, they meant it is Scientology?
The phylogeny you see below represents the basic relationships that tie all life on Earth together. The three domains. This tree, like all phylogenetic trees, is a hypothesis about the relationships among organisms.
Allow me to define a term. Hypothesis. A guess.
Allow me to give you the scientific definition of hypothesis according to Google. It's an idea or explanation that you then test through study and experimentation. The definition given on the Evolution 101 website, which you skipped over, is a proposed explanation for a narrow set of phenomena. A hypothesis must be testable with evidence from the natural world. If an explanation can't be tested with experimental results, observation, or some other means, then it is not a scientific hypothesis. Nothing about guesses there, and it was right in front of you. Also, I would like to point out that they were talking about that particular phylogenetic tree. There are so many species on the planet that correctly classifying them all and correctly placing them on a phylogenetic tree is virtually impossible. So all phylogenies are necessarily hypotheses, as they will likely suffer revision as more is learned about the organisms that are on them.
In this case, a guess based on the presumption that evolution happened in the distant, unobservable past. Remember that as we go along.
Actually, I'd be more inclined to say it was a guess, if you insist on using the word guess, based on our current knowledge of the organisms on the tree, since most of them haven't had their genome sequenced yet. That's kind of what solidifies their place on the tree, although it isn't 100% accurate either.
I'm not saying that it's only my opinion that this phylogenic tree is mere invention. They have just told you that it is.
No, they have told you that it is an hypothesis. Please refer back to the definition of hypothesis as being an idea that is to be tested. So each different phylogeny is the idea of whoever put it together, and that idea is to then be tested against reality. The ones that hold up are the ones that stick around.
This is not a record of observation, but a fabrication which they believe tells a true story.
Do I have to take you back to the whole classification based on common attributes thing? Are you ready to disagree that we are warm-blooded animals with a spinal cord and hair on our bodies, etc., etc.?
Etc., etc., etc.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but this is an admission of faith in something unseen.
So we can see similar traits in organisms, and when we organize these organisms by similar traits, we see that it forms a relatively tidy nested hierarchy, which can then be traced nicely through the fossil record to see where the traits first developed. And that's faith in things unseen? I would disagree, but at this point your argument is basically science is as bad as religion because it uses faith. So you're tacitly admitting that your position is untenable. And since science has produced measurable results and religion has produced dubious results and has often hindered scientific progress, I'm going to throw my hat in with science.
It illustrates the idea that all of life is related and can be divided into three major clades, often referred to as the three domains: archaea, bacteria, and eukaryota. We can zoom in on particular branches of the tree to explore the phylogeny of particular lineages, such as Animalia, outlined in red. And then we can zoom in even further to examine some of the major lineages within vertebrata.
When you dissect the diagram, as we will later in some detail, you will find that the outer rim is made of existing animals, whereas everything inside of that becomes creative speculation.
Are you saying that the creatures on the inner parts of the wheel didn't exist? I mean, they've grouped all known organisms together by shared traits. If evolution were true, you would expect the ones near the bottom of the tree, or center of the wheel in this diagram's case, to be the organisms that existed in earlier time periods. You see, if an organism shares all the traits to make it a chordate, but it doesn't have any traits in common with modern branches of the chordate phylum, then it stands to reason that it was part of a species that had not yet developed those traits. If evolution were not true, we would expect to see traits intermingle among different species. Maybe you'd find a mushroom with a circulatory system, or a cat that's capable of photosynthesis. Or even smaller details, like an organism that would fit perfectly into the chordate phylum, but whose embryos develop a mouth before the anus. What reason did God have for creating all chordates as deuterostomes anyway? A deuterostome being an organism that, in the embryonic stage, the first hole to develop becomes the anus. Protostomes are the opposite, with the first hole becoming the mouth. Why was it so important for God to make us develop ass first in the womb, like every other chordate, and every other mammal, and every other primate, every other haplorine, every other simiiform, and every other hominid? Surely we could live just as well if the mouth grew first, so why not do something to completely undermine the theory of evolution that he knew would develop by giving humans all the same characteristics of the other great apes, except for no reason we could be protostomes instead of deuterostomes? Something like that would go a long way to disproving evolution, but it never happens. I think that would actually be a great way of setting humanity apart from the animal kingdom. You fit perfectly in this very specific category of animals except for one thing. I don't like anuses, so you get to grow a mouth first. Better yet, he could have included a verse in the Bible about it and made it specific so that when we developed the technology to study embryos, we would see that a book written thousands of years ago was exactly right on this topic that people at the time would have had no possible way of knowing. It could even go in Deuteronomy, since the names are so similar. Deuteronomy 1:38. And in years to come, when the Lord your God allows the study of embryos, ye shall surely find that all animals with spinal cords grow their back parts first, except for man, for surely the Lord has set man apart from the animals. And while we're talking about back parts, remember that time in Exodus 33:23 where God mooned Moses? Fun times.
In short, the tire is real, but the spokes and the hub are pure imagination. The tire, the outer ring where real animals live, is really no different than the classification system made by Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s.
Yes, the classification system that Linnaeus came up with but didn't know how to explain, since he was looking for the distinct immutable kinds discussed in Genesis. When he started his classification of life, he found that there really were no such things as distinct immutable kinds, and so that's how he developed his classification system that is still used to some degree today. Basically, the system that's being used today is a combination of Linnaean classification and cladistic classification in what is being termed the total evidence approach. I think this may be why I've confused Linnaean and cladistic classification in previous videos. They are basically being merged, so it can be hard at times to tell them apart.
Except that this one begins with the belief that evolution is the cause of all life on Earth, whereas Carl believed God made everything.
I don't see how those two are necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, if you insist on taking every word of the Bible literally, then yeah, evolution is a no-no. But if some of it can be allegory or analogy, which most creationists will agree, why can't the creation story? I mean, do you seriously believe that there was a talking snake in the Garden of Eden? And remember, we're taking the Bible literally here. Nowhere in the entire Bible does it ever say that the serpent in Eden was Satan. Not even that verse in Revelation where it says that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan who leads the whole world astray. That's simply calling Satan an old serpent, in much the way Jesus called the Pharisees serpents. Serpent here being an insult, since everybody knows that the serpent is a cursed animal for having led Eve to eating the apple. In fact, Genesis 3:1 explicitly says that the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which God had made. If it were a demon in disguise, why would the Bible blatantly call it just another animal, especially if we're supposed to be taking this part of the Bible literally?
Carl was not looking to link everything with everything else, but mainly to see if he could figure out what the created kinds are.
Yes, exactly. But then he found out that everything was linked to everything else, and he laid out some important grounds on which Darwin was able to develop his theory of evolution.
This is why we have a level of biological classification called the kind.
Really? That's the first I've heard of it. Which level is it, pray tell? I see life, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. That's the Linnaean taxonomic system. I did a search for kind on the Wikipedia page for Linnaean taxonomy, and it only came up once. And it seems to be used in a colloquial sense. It can be inferred from the sentence right after it that they're using it to mean species. But the whole paragraph is just talking about how you can refer to an organism with the scientific name in the Linnaean system rather than using local colloquial names, and thereby making things easier for scientists working internationally. It doesn't say anything about using the word kind and species interchangeably.
Just keep in mind that they are creating these trees for their own purposes, not recording observations. There is a difference.
I'm not sure how observing that animals can be classified into various clades or classes and then putting them there is not recording observations. I observe that this animal has a spinal cord, so it fits in with the chordates. I also observe that it has titties, so it is a mammal, etc., ad nauseum.
The tree is supported by many lines of evidence, but it is probably not flawless. Scientists constantly reevaluate hypotheses and compare them to new evidence. As scientists gather even more data, they may revise these particular hypotheses, rearranging some of the branches on the tree.
Bask in the warming glow of the humility it takes to admit that their guesswork is probably not flawless.
Is this the part where you attack scientists for being open to new evidence because they will admit when they don't have all the answers? I mean, you just finished a huge segment of your video complaining that they don't have all the answers, and now you're attacking them for being honest about it? You should at least split that up into 2 videos so it won't be immediately apparent that you're being a huge asshole. Most deuterostomes develop past the stage where all they are is an asshole, but you seem to be stuck there.
Let me say again, we observe the relationship between certain species of the same kind. Most varieties of dogs, for instance.
But what is a kind? You just said that it was one of the levels of Linnaean taxonomy, but you haven't said what level. The Wikipedia article has the word kind used roughly in a species sense, but here you're saying that there are multiple species within a kind. So what is a kind? Genus? You've been complaining this whole series about the word evolution not being defined properly, when in reality it is defined properly, but it's a necessarily broad definition. Yet here you're throwing the word kind around without telling anyone what you mean by it. Like, you're relying on the fact that most people will just have an intuitive feeling of what a kind should be, and will rely on that without any further thought. You aren't allowed to complain about any more scientific definitions until you provide us with a concrete definition of the word kind.
But this is a far cry from having evidence that dogs and cabbages have a common ancestor.
Well, I don't know how similar dog DNA is to cabbage DNA, but humans and cabbages share 57% identical DNA. I think. It's hard to pin down a reliable source for that number, but it seems to be the most commonly cited number. That's not unreasonable, considering that the generally accepted number for shared genes with bananas is about 60%. It stands to reason that most of these genes relate to basic cell function, as those genes would probably change the least over evolutionary time. So yeah, more than half your genetic material is exactly the same as that of a banana, and probably a cabbage too. That seems like some pretty good evidence for common ancestry to me.
The biggest issue here, of which they are seemingly unaware, is that such charts are for our own organization of existing things under broad categories. We've been grouping the different living things for centuries, but then Darwin came along and said,
"Hey, let's connect all of the dots until it forms a picture."
Exactly. The dots were all there, Darwin just connected them. And they have stayed connected through dozens of serious challenges over the last 160 years. Glad you're finally getting the bigger picture.
This is where the hub and the spokes came from. After connecting dots for 150 years, the picture is still really hard to read.
On the contrary, the more I learn about evolution and biology, the more obvious it is to me that evolution is a fact. The picture has never been clearer, and it continues to clarify every year.
As will be made evident by the next amazing piece of data, which is released like a flock of doves into the night sky.
For example, evidence discovered in the last 50 years suggests that birds are dinosaurs, which required adjustment to several vertebrate twigs.
Yes, they think birds are dinosaurs.
Yep, except for the people in the Birds Are Not Dinosaurs, or BAND movement. But they are largely ridiculed in the scientific community for, wait for it, not being willing to change their opinion based on new evidence. Do you think that someone was just sitting around one day and thought, birds have a kind of similar shape to theropods, so they must be dinosaurs, and everyone thought that sounded cool so they jumped on the bandwagon? No, this idea was challenged, but it stood up to all the tests thrown at it and has now achieved scientific consensus.
Make note that this doesn't read, descended with modification from dinosaurs. Chickens? They are dinosaurs. Yeah, much like the International Space Station is a thatched roof cottage.
Again with the argument from personal incredulity. You don't get how something as small and silly looking as a chicken could be in the same category as something as cool as an Albertosaurus, so you just make fun of it and throw it out. Meanwhile, compare the structure and anatomy of an ancient theropod and a modern bird, and you will see that they really are quite similar. I can make a silly sounding comparison, therefore it's not true, is not a valid argument.
And when they say evidence discovered in the last 50 years, they mean to say dedication to evolutionary dogma. I'll explain the flimsy nature of their evidence later.
Just trust me, birds aren't dinosaurs. I know the vast majority of scientists in the relevant fields agree that they are, but they're all wrong. I'll tell you why later, just take my word for it. Sure, whatever. I look forward to that video. Maybe you'll finally stop redefining things to fit your straw man of evolution. I doubt it, but maybe. That's it for this one. Remember to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. And speaking of Patreon, I just realized that I hit my $100 per Friday video goal this month, which means that I'm going to start doing a monthly patron-only hangout starting in January. I'm going to aim for the first week of January, but I might be busy at work that week, so we'll see. I'll keep you posted both on Patreon and on my channel here, so keep an eye out. See you next time!